Vamos a comenzar el panel Vigilancia, Libertad de Expresión, Nuevos Nacionalismos. Es un panel organizado por la Fundación Friedrich Ebert para aportar a uno de los temas más interesantes y más polémicos que tenemos en la agenda de comunicación y en particular en la agenda de libertad de expresión en todo el mundo, que tiene que ver con la vigilancia de casi todo lo que hacemos en Internet. Aquí la Fundación, a partir de la iniciativa de Omar Rincón, ha invitado a un conjunto de expertos, en este caso 4, 3 de los cuales me acompañan: Nick Cauldry, Joana Barón y Germán Rey, y Julie Cohen va a estar acompañándonos por videoconferencia desde Washington para completar una opinión de expertos sobre un tema que ha trascendido fuertemente lo que es los temas de vigilancia estatal, que sin embargo siguen siendo los aspectos tal vez más relevantes y preocupantes de esta situación. Respecto a mecanismos y procedimientos de vigilancia de los estados, algunos democráticos y otros no tanto, acerca de nuestra vida privada en función de objetivos como la lucha contra el crimen o el terrorismo. Pero un debate que largamente ha sido superado respecto a este actor estatal por la presencia vital en el entorno digital de empresas y proveedores de servicios de Internet que están mediando en el acceso que tenemos a la información disponible en Internet y que basan sus modelos de negocios en la recolección masiva de datos personales. Tal vez no sea por las razones que tienen los gobiernos respecto a opciones ideológicas o políticas, sino comerciales, pero la situación es altamente preocupante, tanto para derechos básicos como el de la privacidad, como también para derechos a la libertad de expresión, en tanto estos intermediarios están efectivamente mediando entre los contenidos que colocamos en Internet y los contenidos que recibimos en Internet, y por lo tanto ese monitoreo, esa vigilancia permanente que también se hace de las empresas privadas merece especial atención. Con esta breve introducción yo quiero darle la palabra a Nick Cauldry, de Reino Unido, profesor de Medios, Comunicación y Teoría Social en el Departamento de Medios y Comunicaciones de la London School of Economics, como sociólogo de los medios de comunicación y la cultura, abordando en este campo de estudio desde la perspectiva del poder simbólico que históricamente se ha concentrado en las instituciones de los medios de comunicación. Su trabajo se basa en la teoría social, espacial, democrática y cultural, la antropología, la ética de los medios y la comunicación. Su análisis de los medios como práctica ha sido ampliamente influyente en gran parte del mundo. Es autor y editor de 11 libros y muchos artículos de revistas y capítulos de libros. Nick, bienvenido. Muchísimas gracias por estar. Esperamos con mucha atención tus palabras.
Antes de que Nick empiece, tenemos que hacer un anuncio porque parece ser que hay información cruzada. Les repetimos que este panel se llama Surveillance and Freedom of Expression. Por favor, las personas que tenían pensado ir al otro panel, Comunicación, Desarrollo y Cambio Social, les informamos que este no es el salón es el Barahona 3, por favor. To those interested in the panel 1, Communication, Development and Social Change, we inform you that this is not where is it going to be the presentation. So would you please change to the Barahona 3 auditorium? Thank you.
Gracias, Gustavo. Hoy hablaré en inglés. Es mucho más fácil para mí. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel on surveillance and freedom of expression And I'm going to set out some general principles first, which will hopefully lay the ground for Julie's very important slides, and she's speaking by Skype from Washington. So freedom of expression is a principle of fundamental, almost existential importance in thinking about democracy and thinking about the struggles for democracy. But this panel is considering the very different contexts in which we now have to think about freedom of expression today, when so much of our social expression is on corporately owned digital platforms. In fact, I suggest we need to step back even further and consider how the nature of social space has changed, is changing, which in turn is related to the changed role that media are now playing in the sustaining of social life. Today, media are not just content providers, they provide infrastructures of connection. And given our dependence as subjects, as citizens, on these infrastructures for the connections that we need, the connections that are expected of us to make, it's very important to grasp that the usual relations that we know throughout history between power and dependency, between people and media, are intensified today for 4 different reasons. The first is that in the internet, there is a connection not just from one point to another, some points to some other points, but a connection from every point in space to, in principle, every other point in space. Secondly, the internet has an effectively, through cloud computing, an effectively infinite capacity to store communication traces in time. Thirdly, that connectability arises not just from points in space, but from and to every layer of text that we produce as we act online, operating in what I call in my work a managed continuity. So all these points are connected up into a plane of connection. And crucially, connection is always now in principle reversible. We want to connect to someone else, but they retain the capacity to connect to us. Now, this last point, the 4th point on that slide, is really enormously important for how we think about the power relations in social space today when it operates online. I want to quote here the Italian autonomous thinker Bifo Berardi, who said in his book, The Soul at Work, "We can reach every point in the world, but more importantly, we can be reached from any point in the world." Under these conditions, he argues, privacy and its possibilities are abolished, if we understand this word in its fullest meaning. Or as he puts it more philosophically at the end of his book, the totality generated by computers has replaced Hegel's totality. The totality that Hegel imagined in human history is now replaced by a technically achieved totality of connection. If we put this another way, what is continuous now about social space is not just connection or the possibilities of connection, but it's the continuity of the reverse of connection, which is surveillance, which in an era now of textual harvesting rather than image collection means data valence, not just surveillance. We're not just watched, we are tracked on every possible level. The continuity of this. So if we're trying to think about preserving something like privacy in this world under these conditions, we have to think, and this is not easy, about how to challenge, how to break that totality of connection. We have to challenge the totality of the order of connection which computing demands. And Oscar Gandy and Selena Marin, in a paper just before this, were talking about the social order that's emerging online, and I think this is the key question. But how can we challenge this? And this is where older debates and vocabularies about freedom of expression may need to be expanded. And I pick up a point from the recent book of John Cheney Lippold, where he says that today we still lack the vocabulary needed to enact politics around our algorithmic identities. And I think he's right. But at this point, I want to introduce a concept from Julie Cohen, whose work I greatly admire. I'm not going to speak for her, of course, but there's one insight in her work that I find enormously helpful to think about challenging this totality, which is her idea of discontinuity. challenging the continuity principle on which social space today seems to depend. And in her 2013 essay, What Privacy is For, she introduces the idea of semantic discontinuity as a critical concept. And she says there, semantic discontinuity, that is breaking up the continuity of discourse and connection for discourse in space. This helps to separate context from one another, thereby preserving breathing room for personal boundary management and for the play of everyday practice. This seems a very simple point, just breaking the circuit, but it is of profound importance because it challenges the assumption that when we create some data, maybe voluntarily, corporations must be free to automatically reuse it for other purposes and at other times. It challenges the principle that when our data is collected, maybe we consent to it again, that it then can be aggregated with other data without limit, without our consent. And it challenges the principle that today's business models, today's internet world of sociality is entitled to rely on the continuity of surveillance and data valence because it needs that to work. It challenges that fundamental principle. And this is a really, therefore, profound idea. There's another form of circuit breaking that is very important that Julie doesn't talk about, that's different from the point she makes, and I just want to mention this briefly, which is also challenging the circular discourse that legitimates big data, the myth of big data, if you like. There's a lot of talk today about data as the new oil, as a natural substance that simply has to be put to use by corporations, because if they don't put it to use, we won't have the benefit of it, which of course then legitimates and requires, in fact, the whole infrastructure of data processing to be in place. If you accept that starting point, as many people do, it's the headline in The Economist magazine a few months ago, data as the new oil, this natural metaphor makes unnatural asking any questions which challenge this continuity. It sounds crazy. Why would you challenge the use of data? Don't you want to use the sun, the water, the oil on our planet? Data's just the same. But of course, this is a myth because data is based on a social process of extracting data from human subjects under particular conditions of power. It is not a natural object on any basis. So this is a profoundly mythical idea of enormous practical importance. And I've been researching this discourse around the naturalization of data and data processing in a project that's just about to finish called The Price of Connection, which you can follow up there if you're interested. So defending freedom of expression, I'm arguing, involves at some point challenging the naturalness of continuous data collection through surveillance. Because once we grant that it's natural, then the scope for legal intervention, for normative intervention, is very reduced. And yet, the idea that freedom of expression is unaffected by living under continuous surveillance is a very strange one. It would have been inconceivable 15 years ago to say that democracy now is based around permanent, continuous surveillance of all subjects for all purposes. If you had said that 15 years ago, you would have been said to be mad. Now, if you deny that, you are said to be mad. So something very interestingly has changed. But this is where the attempt to break the circuit of data collection and data aggregation meets a lot of resistance. We heard this in the pre-conference on data, big data from the Global South on Saturday. Someone said after a presentation I gave, well, this is very inconvenient to challenge surveillance. We need connection. We need practical connection, surely. And here there's another point I want to make, which is there's something deeply convenient about surveillance, which is linked to the very nature of computing itself. Because there's a fundamental trade-off involved in all the social uses of computing that Philip Ager pointed out more than 2 decades ago, which is that computers have to capture data in order to function. Our word processor wouldn't work if it didn't remember what we just typed. We want it to work. So as he says, a computer can compute only what it captures. So the point would be that if capture is necessary to computer functioning, complete capture of all data for all purposes becomes necessary for complete computer functioning. But of course, complete computer functioning means optimizing data capture for value, which is the way capitalism has to now function. So you see, we're drawn into this complete world of data capture from a very simple principle of how computers work and the belief then that we want capitalism to function in some way or other. And this very simple but remorseless logic takes us to quite a violent paradox, which I believe is at the heart of contemporary power relations. And the paradox is as expressed by the technological critic Bruce Schneier, who's a great expert on encryption and data capture, who says very directly, the primary business model of the internet is built on mass surveillance. He is struggling against that business model from within the computer industry, but he's very direct about what is at stake here. So, by the same token, how we resist to this state of affairs, how we challenge surveillance, starts to seem difficult. It's tradable. Why wouldn't you give up your resistance in order to have a functioning internet system in the world? Why wouldn't you give that up? But this, of course, remains trading away the very values that are at the heart of democracy. The idea of freedom from surveillance, autonomy, becomes now inconvenient for democracy. There's a very violent paradox going on here. So the question is there a way forward? Well, I think the first way forward in an abstract level is to affirm values, which are democratic values, which we know we cannot trade, which we know must not be negotiable. That's actually very hard because in the end, most of us would agree that this or that value is tradable for survival. It's not easy to say that any values are fundamentally non-negotiable. So to think about what that would mean, I think there are one or two conditions. The first condition about the value we would want to defend, to resist surveillance, is that it has to express something essential about human beings, even if in a historically contingent form. I'm afraid I'm not a post-humanist. I do not know what a post-humanist is. They don't exist in my view. We need to think about what is essential for human life, even though the details change. The second point is that this value must provide a prior motivation for wanting democracy. Because if it's not that important, it won't be sufficient to get us to resist something which is threatening democracy. Also, this for me comes to a fundamental value, which is the value of autonomy. I can't go into any detail here, but this relates to Hegel's idea that we need the freedom to be with ourselves, at home with ourselves, in the other, that is, in a mediated, socially grounded relationship. This is the space in which we grow into ourselves. But today we face a fundamental conflict between this form of socially based autonomy and surveillance. Education is a fundamental area where kids in schools are now being permanently tracked on the basis this is the only way they will grow into free human beings. The paradox is this is the only way they will lose their only possibility of freedom. But this is offered as freedom, a very violent conflict. We can also look at the important legal references, which Julie, I'm sure, will come back to. In the German Constitution, Article 2 defends the right to free development of the personality. This same principle is in the Brazilian Marco Civil, Article 2, Paragraph 3 in 1903. It also underlies the European General Data Protection Regulation. There's a lot of work going on now which is thinking about the rights, the values which underlie the rights that we need to defend if we are to defend ourselves against permanent, continuous surveillance. There's also very important work in the States by a colleague of Julie's, Neil Richards, on the US First Amendment, which, as you know, is about freedom of speech, but is also about freedom to think. And he then makes a profound point in a recent book, that to have the freedom to think, we also need to protect those moments when we rehearse for thinking, when we develop ideas, when we read a book. We, in a confused way, try to understand what the book is saying to us. This is rehearsal for thinking, But this is exactly what Amazon is tracking through its e-readers. When we turn over a page on a book, on an e-reader, it is noticed and counted and compared with other data. And he argues that that is fundamentally against the US First Amendment. So there are things that can be done and thought. But my final point to sum up is that today, and this panel is about freedom of expression, the freedom of speech in the traditional liberal model, it is not enough to defend this, even though it remains essential, because freedom of expression is now at stake in a much bigger battle, which is a battle for the freedom of all of us to exist and develop as autonomous persons who are capable of being democratic citizens in spaces which are not owned by external power. We have to find and defend those spaces and imagine how they can still exist. In other words, in defending freedom of expression, we need to defend something more, which is the continuing possibility of private life itself. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Nick. Al final de las intervenciones vamos a hacer preguntas, por supuesto, pero ahora seguimos con el orden del día. Julie, si estás para ahí, nos gustaría escuchar tus palabras. Mientras se prepara, la voy a presentar. Ella es norteamericana, profesora de Derecho de la Universidad de Georgetown, es experta en Derecho y Tecnología y una de las principales teóricas sobre privacidad en ese país. Enseña y escribe sobre los derechos de autor, la regulación de la privacidad de la información y la gobernabilidad de las redes de información y comunicación. Es miembro de la Junta Asesora del Centro de Información sobre Privacidad Electrónica. Antes de incorporarse a la Facultad de Derecho, en 1999, la profesora Cohen fue profesora asistente de Derecho en la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Pittsburgh. Trabajó con la firma McCutcheon, Doyle, Brown & Anderson en San Francisco, donde se especializó en litigios de propiedad intelectual. Finalmente, en una larga presentación y antecedentes que hacen que estas palabras sean muy interesantes para todos nosotros, Julie Cohen fue secretaria del juez Stephen Reinhardt de la Corte de Apelaciones de los Estados Unidos para el 9º Circuito. Julie, bienvenida. 15 minutos.
Okay, thank you. I am very sorry I couldn't be there with you. The weather did not permit the planes to fly, so I'm sorry for the remote presentation, but we'll do our best. So do I have the title slide up? Yes, okay, so next slide. So I'm going to speak to you about the platform economy, and I will get to freedom of expression, and I will freedom of expression and surveillance. That discussion needs to be contextualized against the background of a second great transformation in the political economy of beginning with the developed world and then coming along the developing world from industrial capitalism to informational capitalism. So please bring up the first block of text. So there's a well-known discussion by Karl Polanyi of the three components of the economic transformation from agrarian capitalism or agrarianism rather to industrial capitalism that was a combination of the appropriation of land and raw materials, commodification of labor, land, and money, so learning to see and to understand these things as commodities rather than people and the places where they lived. And third, patterns of local barter and exchange became detached from local contexts and re-embedded in the market, which was a fictional construct. I think next block of text, the parallel in the transformation to informational capitalism is three new aspects of a new transformation. We are seeing now an expansion and proliferation of abstract informational entitlements, where before it was the appropriation of land and raw materials, now it is intellectual property, trade secrets, and information. We are seeing, second, a dematerialization of labor, land, and money into streams of data, and they're actually being joined, of course, as Nick already mentioned, by a fourth stream of data, which is data about people. And then finally and critically, there's an organizational component to the change, which is that patterns of barter and exchange are becoming detached from markets now and re-embedded in platforms. Next slide, please. So platforms emerge from this exercise in sort of mapping parallel trends as core organizational logics of the emerging information economy. Please bring up the first block of text. So it's important to say a little bit about the functions of platforms. Some of the platforms the functions of platforms are not entirely new. So platforms are intermediaries, and platforms step in to a zone of activity that used to be performed by advertising agencies and market researchers and the like. But what platforms do that is new is they take these functions, intermediation and legibility, and they make them infrastructural. Both intermediation, obviously, is performed through the infrastructure by platforms, but the idea of making populations of users legible is burrowed into the core of the infrastructure and becomes part of the function of the infrastructure. And platforms do something else here that is also new and unusual. They may be core organizational logics of the information economy, but they are also firms. They're also legal entities, private for-profit legal entities, and they have profit strategies in mind as they perform this infrastructural intermediation and legibility. And the profit strategies are organized around access to data, control of data and algorithms, and often using finance capital to leverage those profit strategies. Next block of text, please. So we should see now the bottom block of text on the slides that talks about the disruptive effects of these platform intermediation and legibility processes. Disruption in Silicon Valley is a virtue, but I'm just meaning to use it here more neutrally to point out that platforms disrupt, unsettle, disarrange a lot of the things that we think we know about how social, economic, epistemological, and political processes work. So socially, they give us a sense of extraordinary generativity. This is Nick's point about connection from every point to every other point, but also oddly within constraint, right, as defined by the technical protocols of the platform. You can tag your photos in Facebook a certain way, but not other ways, for example. Platforms disrupt economics profoundly. There was a very long time during which economists thought they understood how markets worked. Platform markets are multi-sided markets. There are often at least three groups, individual users, corporate sellers of products and services, and advertisers. And platforms can disaggregate those populations and manage each set of relationships separately, which means that the economics are very different from what anybody understands. Epistemologically, because the data flows become personalized and because it's inscrutable, by which I mean you can't tell how the data flows are being personalized. Platform flows of information often disrupt how we think we come to know things. They disrupt the ability to say, oh, this narrative is factual and that narrative is not. They sort of flatten the epistemological universe and make everything seem to be equivalent. And politically, because flows of information are controlled by invisible algorithms that are difficult to understand, there is a great disruption in how we come together as democratic polities and form a common purpose. Next slide, please. Now, back to my point about platforms are not simply organizational logics, but also themselves firms or legal entities. A consequence of that and what I work on a lot in my work is that platforms are themselves legal entrepreneurs. Platforms are agents, and they seek to use the legal system to rearrange rights and obligations and institutions in ways that serve their own narrow purposes. And there are 3 sets of strategies. So you should see now the block of text that says 3 sets of strategies that I want to talk a little about: appropriative privilege, innovative immunity, and emergent sovereignty. Next slide, please. So this should be the slide that says appropriative privilege. One thing that platforms do as legal entrepreneurs is they transform the complex of legal relations around access to and appropriation of and use of personal data. So first block of text. There's a myth, I think, in legal processes in the US and around the world that people come to platforms for convenience and consent to the surrender of their personal information. But in fact, what platforms set in motion is a large-scale socio-technical reorganization of the media infrastructural environment for data cultivation and harvesting, not simply communications, but the sensors that are starting to be embedded in the Internet of Things. And crucially, also policing and development initiatives rolled out across the world. New programs for online banking in developing countries, for example, fingerprinting of enemy combatants, and as a template for fingerprinting of welfare applicants, as a template for fingerprinting and biometric cultivation, biometric harvesting from people seeking to cross borders everywhere. Now, so the myth is that there's consent to all of this, but the reality is that populations worldwide are becoming reconfigured as raw material. And the platform strategy is to rearrange the understanding of legal entitlement so that this seems normal and natural. Bottom block of text on this slide, please. And so what that entails is that legal interest in the raw material that you and I might all have, because after all, the raw material is our own data, becomes subordinated to privilege claims of the data harvesters, the platforms, and the data brokers. And there's a narrative of legal privilege that is constructed to legitimate harvesting from the public domain of personal data in a process that really comes to resemble industrial scale agriculture more than anything else. Just as one would cultivate varieties of corn or wheat that are optimized for industrial scale harvesting, so the platform model is to cultivate varieties of personal data that are optimized for harvesting and take them in and process them. And the entities with the legal privilege in that narrative are the platforms themselves. Next slide, please. The second strategy is innovative immunity. So there's a myth about media infrastructures and the function they perform that is fairly common, and it's sort of bound up with the sort of evolution of Western liberal ideologies, and that is that media infrastructures are technologies of freedom. So the printing press, of course, was the beginning, and as we have had invented then radio and television and now the internet, the argument that these infrastructures are technologies of freedom has strengthened. First block of text on the slide, please. I think the reality is quite different, because the data harvesting processes that I just described set in motion another kind of massive socio-technical reorganization around new affordances for affective and epistemological manipulation. So it becomes less important, for example, if you are Google, to know what people are saying in their emails to one another, if you have the technologies to measure how long people hover their mouse on a part of a web page, or what they're looking at, or if you have the technologies to embed in supermarkets sensors to tell when somebody is walking down the aisle and to decide if they paused in front of this product or that product. There are technologies for behavioral advertising and neuromarketing that bypass really conscious involvement on the part of consumers or users and just go for straight up behavioral measurement and calibration. And when those measurements are then used to sort of process our data and feed back to us streams of data that the platform firms and data firms predict we will want to see, what we start to see is a divergence, an epistemological and political divergence, as different kinds of narratives, not just about commercial products, but narratives about reality and about the subject of political debates, narratives about climate change, for example, or healthcare, become bifurcated and peeled off into different streams that convey to different audiences dramatically different depictions and representations of reality in the world. As that starts to happen, facts become destabilized. And then another strand of the instability that we see emerging in the online environment has to do with identity theft and reputation. It becomes much easier because the streams of data are constantly flowing, to come in as a bad actor and appropriate streams of someone else's data and use them for one's own purpose. So the myth is technologies of freedom. The reality we're starting to see is technologies optimized for manipulation and instability. Next block of text, it's just 2 lines. And the narrative that then comes into the legal process as a way of legitimating that shift from sort of reason to instability is the narrative that Nick already mentioned, the myth of big data, the narrative continuity of continual progress through innovation. In the US in particular, there is a narrative now that makes that into an exercise of expressive freedom on behalf of the platform firms themselves. So the networked data harvesting and predictive process is reframed as a depoliticized engine for expression and innovation, and that process itself becomes cloaked in legal and often constitutional privilege. Next slide, please. A third set of strategies that I think is important to this process turns back to states. And what we are seeing in networked media spaces is not simply naked power grabs that are succeeding on the part of platforms, but really interesting power struggles and contests between platforms and states. And they sort of shape up as contests over interdiction of information flows and control of information flows. There are particular kinds of information flows that states would like to stop from flowing around dangerous knowledge, which could be terrorist information, or it could simply be politics that the state disfavors, around digital contraband, so flows especially of intellectual property that are unauthorized, and about flows of information that, that sort of peel the cloak back from the state's own operational secrecy. And states would like platforms to cooperate in helping block these flows of data, but platforms would like not to surrender so much of their own sovereignty over their own operations. And what we see then unfolding is a series of continual struggles in which platforms engage in highly performative demonstrations of their own sovereignty. They file legal actions against particular requests from the state, and they have recourse back to the narrative of productive innovation and depoliticized progress through innovation, and tell in the public a story about how state control would bring all that beneficial innovation to a halt. And so back and forth we go. And please have at this point the entire slide on the screen. And so what we see emerging is a struggle between two different kinds of interdiction rules. In some contexts, we have legal rules that limit what platforms can do, and in other contexts, we have algorithmic rules that platforms put in place themselves in an attempt to forestall state control. So, for example, the struggle in Europe over who is going to implement the right to be forgotten and how is a great example of this. The ongoing struggles over filtering out copyright infringing material on YouTube or Google is another great example. And through this process, I think platforms are emerging as a quite unusual species of transnational corporation. There's been for a long time a debate about whether transnational corporations are becoming too powerful because they behave as though they can resist the demands of sovereign states around the world. But to be a sovereign state, you need to do more than resist. You need to exercise sovereignty to govern your own populations and your own territories. Platforms, I think, are the first kind of transnational legal entity that can credibly claim to have territories and populations. And platforms are emerging as kinds of sovereigns that in some contexts exercise rival power to states. And I don't think we've seen the end of that process by a long shot. But it's very interesting that some European nations are now beginning to appoint special government ministers to serve as ambassadors for digital, which is just a very strange development, diplomatically speaking. Next slide, which is the last slide. Back to Nick's final point about what is needed and about rejecting posthumanism. I think that if we are to have in the network digital era a tenable conception of fundamental rights that are not just words and that actually mean something, attention needs to be given in a very sustained way to the intermediation and by platforms and the mediation and destabilization of the information environment. It is very conventional within legal circles to talk about rights as liberties. So if I have the freedom of expression, that means in theory I am at liberty to say what I please. And it has become also more conventional to talk about rights in terms of capabilities. Well, I don't really have the freedom of expression that other people have if I can barely afford to feed myself and my children, and I have to work 20 hours a day just to keep body and soul together. And that is the discourse that has emerged of fundamental rights as capabilities, which I think is very important. But I think to those two discourses, we need to begin to join a third strand, which is fundamental rights as affordances. I don't have really expressive freedom if I don't have access to networked media structures, some degree of freedom from the mediation and the intermediation that shows me only what some other entity has decided is good for me to see, and I don't have any idea how it is working. The affordances of our media infrastructures are a crucial determinant of the expressive freedom that we all now enjoy increasingly as more and more discourse moves online. And the ability to get that under control will be, I think, in the future, a very crucial determinant of the capacity for democratic self-governance that we have. Thank you very much. That's it.
Gracias, Yuri. Excelente exposición. Es una pena que no estés acompañándonos aquí, pero se escuchó muy bien y muy claro. Muchas gracias. Ya está pronta para hablar nuestra tercer participante, que es Joana Barón. Ella viene de Brasil. Es investigadora y defensora de los derechos de la intimidad y la libertad de expresión, fundadora y directora de Coding Rights, un think and do creado para investigar, promover la comprensión y contribuir a avanzar en las luchas políticas para hacer cumplir los derechos humanos en el mundo digital. Es consultora de Consumers International sobre derechos de privacidad en un proyecto entre Brasil y Alemania. Trabajó con el Instituto de Tecnología y Sociedad sobre Vigilancia y Seguridad Digital y con Global Partners Digital on Internet Governance desde la perspectiva de las economías emergentes. Entre otras cosas, es miembro de la Junta Asesora de Web We Want, una campaña de la World Wide Web Foundation y del Consejo Asesor de Open Technology Fund. Además, co-creadora de varios proyectos creativos que operan en la interacción entre derecho, artes y tecnologías, tales como antivigilancia.org, protestos.org, freenetfilm.org y recientemente se unió a Deep Lab. Joana, bienvenida. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. 15 minutos de intervención, por favor.
¿Ya está? ¿Sí? Hola a todas, hola a todos. Es un placer estar acá en Colombia. Yo soy pues brasileña, pero soy mitad colombiana también. Mi papá es caleño, entonces siempre venir acá a presentar cosas es un placer y un honor. Bueno, la presentación que voy a hacer es un poquito distinta de la presentación de los profesores. Tiene bastante que ver con la manera que Coding Rights ha tratado de los temas de privacidad, vigilancia, que es intentar traducirlo para una audiencia, pues para los usuarios de Internet o de tecnologías digitales, para que se tenga más fuerza y poder de advocacy para cambiar las cosas. Entonces, les vengo a contar la historia, y que es la historia de chupadatos. Tenemos una relación abusiva con nuestras tecnologías favoritas y sospechamos que pueden estar poseídas por el chupadatos. Estos dispositivos son bonitos, gentiles, nos hacen compañía, nos hacen sentir atractivos y amparados. Nos apasionamos por ellos y depositamos en ellos toda nuestra confianza, desde los gestos más cotidianos hasta los secretos más íntimos. Ellos son nuestros objetos de deseo y sueño de consumo, hasta el día que nos damos cuenta que controlan lo que hacemos y monitorean con quienes nos encontramos y comparten nuestra intimidad con gente que no tiene nada que ver con eso. La inteligencia del chupadatos fue descubrir que a cada búsqueda, a cada like, a cada share, a cada compartir, o incluso información de cuánto tiempo el cursor de nuestro mouse pasa sobre una imagen, es algo que podría ser monetizado. La especificidad de ese sistema es que nuestros y nuestras tecnologías favoritas están constantemente trabajando gratis. Nosotros y nosotras, con nuestras tecnologías favoritas estamos constantemente trabajando gratis para construir perfiles cada vez más detallados sobre nuestros gustos y nuestros hábitos. Así que el éxito de ese modelo depende de que creamos en el hecho de que la información de la cual se alimenta el chupadatos es irrelevante y que nadie debería tener nada a esconder. Así, existen varias versiones de esa entidad creadas a medida para cada ambiente. Nuestras ciudades, nuestras casas, nuestros bolsillos y hasta nuestros cuerpos. El chupadados promete, a partir de conceptos como el Big Data, Smart Cities, Internet de las Cosas, que la abundancia de datos, sumada a la alta capacidad de procesamiento de las computadoras con algoritmos inteligentes, facilitarán y proporcionarán más eficiencia a las ventas, a la economía, al combate al crimen, la movilidad, la protección del medio ambiente, a la garantía de la seguridad, a la salud y muchos otros problemas que enfrentamos globalmente. Pero de hecho, ¿cómo funcionan esas tecnologías y a servicio de qué interés trabajan? Son pocas las iniciativas que prevén el impacto de su omnipresencia y hay fuertes indicios de que el chupadados podría ampliar las desigualdades sociales y perpetuar las asimetrías de poder. Con la creencia de que el procesamiento matemático de datos revela verdades neutras y absolutas, estamos adoptando indiscriminadamente herramientas y soluciones creadas por un grupo bastante restrito de personas. Las tecnologías reproducen las tendencias políticas y la mirada del mundo de quienes las creó. Y a pesar de que no conocemos el rostro del chupadatos, sus entidades más recurrentes muestran rostros masculinos, colonialistas y elitistas, que en la mayoría de las veces se alinean con los que quieren callar las voces disidentes o mantener el status quo en las dinámicas de poder globales. Entonces, intentando dejar más claro esas historias del chupadados, tenemos esta plataforma y les voy a enseñar algunos de los artículos y conclusiones que montamos de manera bastante visual con prácticas de periodismo investigativo. Esa es la plataforma y abajo tenemos historias, varias historias, y yo voy a entrar en 3 de ellas, las que tienen perspectiva de género y feminista sobre uso de las tecnologías y otra que tiene que ver con datos del transporte público y integración de bases de datos públicas y privadas. La primera historia es sobre trackers. Trackers son ese pequeño código, línea de código que está en cada website que navegamos. Voy a enseñarles una infografía que hicimos. A cada website que entramos, en media, tenemos como 200 trackers. Y hay diferentes tipos de trackers, cookies, web beacons, pixel tags, son diferentes clases de trackers. Esos trackers agregan información, nuestra información de navegación, información de nuestro dispositivo para crear una huella digital. Con esa huella digital vamos dejando rastros a todo, sobre todo que accedemos en nuestra navegación en Internet. Y aunque digan que ese rastro no está asociado con nuestro nombre, basta el hecho de que estemos logados en Facebook, por ejemplo, y se puede asociar esa navegación a tu nombre también. Frente a esa huella digital, la industria de trackers se junta con la industria de los data brokers y crean perfiles. Y esos perfiles son utilizados por publicidad. Pero el punto que traemos aquí en ese artículo fue que hicimos un experimento. Una amiga que estaba embarazada, por todo su embarazo dejó todas sus privacy settings, sus